Hey everybody, I'm Ryan Douglas, the teaching pastor at the 456. Thanks so much for joining us today. Just wanted to visit with you a little bit, kind of about legalism, and visit with you a little bit about grace. I grew up in church. I've been in church my entire life. The church that I was in early on, until I was about 8 or 9, was this church where men had to wear slacks all the time. So you wore slacks. Women could only wear skirts. It was just very formal. And then, you didn't touch playing cards. You were discouraged from going to the movies. Of course, dancing was just considered of the devil. And it was just very, very strict. There were some really good things about it too. I enjoyed the Awanas program, and then my dad would occasionally drive the bus for the bus ministry. I'd get to ride along with him. We'd pick up some of the people and bring them to church, and there were some good things about it too. But I remember early on, just kind of my life being shaped by our pastor who just stood behind the pulpit. He would read his sermon basically, or I don't know. My impression, as I think back on it, was that he was very flat. And maybe that was my impression because of the next pastor. So we moved to a different church when I was in 5th grade. And this guy was kind of a short guy, and he would walk all over the stage. And I remember thinking as a 10-year-old, I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know you could move. I didn't know you could walk around. There was this very decided factor in my life where I thought, man, that is cool. You can be a preacher and you can move. And he was the first guy that I'd ever heard. I had only ever been under one preacher before, but he was the first guy that I'd ever heard who really seemed excited about what he was teaching about. And so it kind of began to shift my perspective a little bit. And so what does this have to do with legalism? What does this have to do with freedom? My first 9 years of Christianity, not Christianity, but life, I was growing up under this pastor who was very rigid. His teaching was very rigid. And then my next experience was a pastor who just had a lot of joy and just really seemed to enjoy God and seemed to enjoy the ministry that he had and seemed to be excited about it. And that was new for me. Now, one of the things about that is that growing up in church, I got taught, basically all I did is I traded kind of one legalism for another, right? And so as I got older, I didn't feel like playing cards were of the devil. I didn't feel like dancing was of the devil. I'm a terrible dancer. I don't dance for other reasons. It's because I have 2 left feet and I am a terrible dancer. Michelle and I didn't even dance at our own wedding. And I really don't know why we didn't. I think we were just exhausted and we were ready. I think we stayed at our reception for 30 minutes. But anyway, that might be why we didn't dance. We'll have to ask her. But I like movies, I like playing cards, and so I shook off some of those things. But then what happened was, as I got a little bit older and a little more mature in my faith, then I adopted a whole new set of rules. Whether they were rules that people taught me or whether it was just kind of my own impression, I had a whole new list of rules. You've got to pray every day, you've got to read your Bible every day, you've got to go to church every time the doors are open. These are the things you've got to do to be a good Christian. And as I got older, decidedly older, late 20s, early 30s, and was no longer a teenager, one of the things that I realized, what really shaped it for me was in 1998. I was 23, and I spent some time in India. I went on a trip to India. I was there for 7 weeks by myself. And I would hop on the back of this motorcycle with this preacher, and we would go out to these villages, and sometimes it'd be an hour motorcycle ride, and sometimes it'd be a 4-hour motorcycle ride. And we would go out and we'd hold these little services in this little mud hut with a grass roof, and all the people from the village would come and kind of squeeze into this one place, and we would have this worship service. And I remember asking the traveling minister, and I'd just say, how do you do this every week? And he goes, no, I make it to this village about once every 3 or 4 weeks. And we went to a different church, sometimes 2 a day, different villages. And one of the things that dawned on me was, here's this pastor who is kind of over all these people who were illiterate. They didn't have a Bible in their language. And he is making this circuit between 50 churches. And he's going to a different church every day. And so in the course of a month or 6 weeks, he'd hit all these churches, but it would take him that long. And I remember that really kind of changed my perspective on, I don't know, because I had always grown up that you need to be at church Sunday morning, you need to be at church Sunday night, you got to go Wednesday night for the prayer time. If you don't do those things, you're not a good Christian. And here were some people that I was worshiping with who, by the way, were having 4 or 5 hour worship services in this sweltering mud hut in the middle of summer in India. And they were rejoicing, and they were clearly worshipers of God, and they were delighting in the Lord. And when this other guy was preaching, they were just like laser focused. And I didn't understand a word of what he said because I didn't speak that dialect. And then I didn't understand a word of what we were singing, but luckily for me, he had printed out a sheet of the phonetic words, and I could kind of sort of sing along. At the end of 7 weeks, I could sing along. I didn't always know what I was saying, but here was this experience with people of a completely different culture than mine who were worshiping God, who were making much of Jesus. And it really began to shape for me this mindset that has really now been 20 years in kind of the making of my heart, is that the chief goal isn't to get people to church. The chief goal, looking back on my young days in that first church, the chief goal isn't to get people not to play with playing cards. The chief goal isn't to get people to not dance. The chief goal isn't to get people to memorize a certain number of verses. The chief goal isn't to have people show up Wednesday night for prayer meeting like those are the really special Christians. I have heard so many conversations, right? We have 300 on Sunday mornings and we've only got 10 on Wednesday nights. But the chief goal is to know God. Like to know God, to worship Him, to delight in Him. And so that's what I want to leave you with today, is that whatever system you grew up in, whether it was kind of a fundamentalist Baptist like mine, or whether it was some other, maybe you grew up in a system where really always the chief goal was to know Christ and to worship Him. And if that's the case, then you are fortunate and blessed, and man, that's just amazing. But for most of us as Christians, we carry some standard of legalistic kind of condition other than just knowing Jesus. And here's what I want you to know. As you're watching this today, all the things that you think you failed at, all the things that you think you're crushing, put them all aside. All the victories and all the losses, put them all aside. Wipe the ledger clean. Don't boast in your victories. Don't mourn in the losses. And today, can we just agree, you and I, can we just agree that our aim is to know God and to make much of Him? Can we just agree that's the freedom we have, that's the joy that we have, that's the delight we have? And if you read your Bible every day, great. And if you're at church every time the doors are open, great. And if you can't be, great. Make much of Jesus. Honor God. And let that be our focus, and let that be the freedom that we walk in. And so I hope that will encourage you a little bit. Let's talk more about it. Swing by the house sometime and we can visit, and I'll talk to you soon.